neXt Curve.
Welcome to another episode of neXt Curve's Rethink podcast, where tech industry thought leaders discuss the trends and technologies that are shaping our digital future. I'm Leonard Lee, Managing Director and founder of neXt Curve, and today I'm happy to have, once again, a rather regular guest, Joe Hoffman, fellow industry analyst and research director with SAR Insights and Consulting. And if you don't know Joe, why don't you introduce yourself really quick?
Sure. Happy to be here, Leonard. I'm the Director of Embedded Machine Learning and Sensors and Connectivity at SAR for these sorts of things. And I've come from a background from chip design to product management to system engineering and now in the analyst world. And in case your viewers haven't figured out, we always have a great time when we get together.
Oh, yeah. And if you don't follow us on LinkedIn, you should. This man is brilliant. And we have some really great conversations. And it's educational for me to have friends like Joe that I can banter with on, social media in a constructive way, and one where we foster learning. So it's actually kind of cool. So today, Joe, we're going to talk about a topic that you and I have been batting around for quite some time, and that is RISC-V. And it looks like, especially with the recent announcement of NVIDIA acquiring ARM, that RISC-V is going to get a lot of attention. And so I think this is a really, really timely discussion. We'd actually planned this a while back. We didn't know that the NVIDIA thing was going to go through. So this is going to be an interesting discussion. And there's 4 things that we're going to talk about today. Number one, we'll talk about, what is RISC-V? Introduce RISC-V really quickly, and then we'll talk about what is the state of RISC-V. So it's great that there's this technology out there, but what does it really mean? How ready is it? And what is its future viability? And then we'll talk about what the role could be of RISC-V in the overall semiconductor electronics industry ecosystem. And you know how much I don't like the word ecosystem. So overused. Anyways. And then finally, we will talk about neutrality and its importance to the future of the semiconductor industry. And I think that kind of ties into what we'll talk about in terms of the role of RISC-V in the future. So really quick, why don't we dive into the first bullet item, which is what is RISC-V? And you want to give folks a quick rundown?
RISC-V is an open source instruction set architecture that's supported by the RISC-V Foundation. Originally developed at UC Berkeley about 10 years ago.
10 years ago, yep.
And it's been going along ever since then. A couple of years ago, the foundation put together, and they today have basically 4 processor architectures that they can develop, deploy, and implement into your systems. They're quite mature for what they're offering.
Right.
But owing to their RISC roots, for example, they only have like 60 instructions in their set. And what that means for your implementing especially low power and tiny ML architectures is you're not wasting a lot of power multiplying up, doing all the other instruction sets that have to be powered up and done things with a more complicated instruction set. So that's kind of what they are, and it's open sourced, and anybody can pick it up and run it without having to put down an 8-figure initiation fee or anything like that. So That's kind of where they are, and it's people are actually doing things with it these days.
The RISC-V Foundation, I think it was founded in 2015. I think it was. RISC was invented, or it was started in Berkeley 10 years ago. Right. I think we just want to make sure we got that right for the audience. And so, yeah, you're right. And so it supports 32, 64, and 128 bit application. So you could apply it for a wide spectrum of different types of devices, that low powered, tiny embedded devices all the way up to theoretically servers. They haven't really gotten there, but I guess that is something that we can maybe look forward to. I think there's a lot of talk about it, but we'll get into that in a little bit. DARPA's been pretty heavily involved in using RISC-V for various military-related applications as well. So there's a little bit of a U.S. military or defense Department of Defense plug in there as well. I think one of the things that is notable is in November of 2019, the foundation decided to move itself to Switzerland. And that was in reaction to a lot of the U.S. trade policies becoming very restrictive. And so, one of the things that I think is quite notable about the foundation is there is ironically, a fairly heavy Chinese contingency or membership. In fact, I think a number of the platinum members, if you will, are Chinese companies and Chinese interests. So anyways, I thought that was a really interesting move. I've told you in the past, having worked with a lot of Chinese companies, I know that a lot of the Chinese vendors and tech companies have been looking at RISC-V for quite some time. So, unfortunately, we have these less than healthy geopolitics going on at the moment. I think RISC-V, it's sort of in the middle, right? If you really look at what's happening with the semiconductor industry and the State Department, as well as the Department of Commerce is instituting in terms of trade policy.
Yeah, that is an unfortunate fact of the way things are today. But
yeah.
I was just reading this morning, I think was might have been in Business Insider, about more and more companies worldwide are seeking to extricate themselves from dependency on American technology. It won't be easy, but you can see that there is that concern about trade, supply, and continuity, and what are the latest whims of whoever might be in the administration during the upcoming terms. Who knows? So that is definitely a situation for them to be concerned with. Now, in taking this on, it wasn't just a situation where they're running from the U.S. government, but they needed to make sure that they were indeed trade neutral for anywhere and everywhere they went, and especially since it is open source technology and nobody owns it. There are no patents on that. So it is indeed an embodiment of the open source world applied to something that's physically manifested.
Geopolitics aside, why don't we talk about the state of RISC-V? I mean, there's a lot of talk now, especially with NVIDIA having come to this agreement with ARM to acquire that company. They're not open, obviously. It's a company that sells semiconductor IP to its licensees including Apple, Qualcomm, and many others. That transaction was met, I think, with a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, at least from an opinion perspective, right? And I think there's now growing interest in RISC-V as possibly just being a viable open source alternative to a proprietary source that was accessible, unlike, with x86, the ISA for Intel's chips are not public available. That's totally proprietary, right? And so now we're getting to a point where we've had, I guess, the only other option for chip makers to go and build their own chips. Now there's this growing interest for open source.
RISC-V Foundation is not so foolish as to try and play the David to take on Goliath and knock out ARM. That's just not going to happen. But what their advantage and what they're going after is primarily what you can do, because it is open, is you can actually craft things to your domain-specific architectures rather than just picking up the ARM core and plopping it down into your system. And of course, you get to recompile it and all that. The semiconductor industry they've figured out how to retarget and recompile things for quite a number of years now. So it's not that big of a deal to actually consider saying, okay, I've got these fundamental architectures and I want to move to this. But when you do something like that, the big advantage is taking advantage of the features that you have there without having to try and tear apart the ARM architectures. And there are apparently two classes of licenses you can have to use ARM. One is just to use it. The second one is if you want to do like Apple, where you can actually optimize from top to bottom, inside, outside, and across boundaries and everything they're doing in their AirPod Pros. So there's that. And that's the main thing I think is the value of doing this with RISC-V, is that from the start you can do those sorts of things. Maybe you don't have the semiconductor chip design expertise to do all that, but there are a number of companies that assist us in the ecosystem, as you will, or in the community, that make a living of helping companies like this. It's not impossible. For example, look at Red Hat. They made a handy living supporting and selling open source Linux. So the model is there.
So we're still really in early days for RISC-V, right? Because I think there's a lot of folks who are asking the question, well, how viable is RISC-V as an alternative to ARM today? And it still has a long way to go.
That's not to discount people who actually already are using it. I understand that you can find some of the smaller RISC cores for very low power applications inside of some vendor cell phone chips. Without naming names or anything like that. So that's out there. I would not be surprised that it shows up in places like hard drive controllers, other microcontrollers, things of that nature going forward. If you're looking for the very high-end application processors, like some of the high-end A-series from ARM, well, there's a whole bag of toolkits and operating software and things that go along with that that's probably not there yet with RISC-V. But you definitely have the interest in the powerful backers in the foundation that are basically sponsoring the thing to move it right along. And it's up to them to decide how they want to use that. And so the capability is there.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting to see that some of the big semiconductor boys are interested in actually investing in some of the startups. And so, I think some of the notable ones, I mean, one that you introduced me to is it Sci-Fi? Sci-Fi, right, is one. Right. Yeah, Dover Microsystems is another. I think they're creating security solutions for RISC-V chipsets. So there's a number of startups. They're mostly startups at the moment, but getting a lot more visibility, and there seems to be a lot of quote unquote incumbent interest in what they're doing and RISC-V in general. It's weird. We're doing this podcast on I think it's the 16th. Today is the 16th, right? Yesterday there was an announcement by the Sci-Fi that they have a what do you call it, a PC processor, RISC-V based PC processor that they're going to be offering. They have, and then there's also another company called it's Microchip Technology. They've come out with the RISC-V SoC with an embedded FPGA for embedded devices, and so. It looks like they're starting to move up the chain, right, a bit, especially with the desktop, because I think most of the applications that have been built using RISC-V have been more in the embedded domain, wouldn't you say?
Right. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, even as a PC processor kind of thing, that's a market that Qualcomm wants to play in and develop going forward. And so if you've looked at some of the new laptops that support 5G, especially, they're doing quite a bit of powerful things with their Snapdragon and their PC focus on doing those sorts of things. So it's a real Smash Brothers melee out there right now.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so going forward, what are some of your thoughts on the role of RISC-V and the present and going into the future?
I think the whole deal on ARM is going to cause a lot of its generation. I would call it the executive injector, where the people that are running the businesses will reach out to their engineering teams and say, why don't you take a look at this and tell me what do you think? Because they're a little nervous about this. I mean, here we have ARM is about $1.9 billion of revenue, according to Wall Street Journal. Yeah. And NVIDIA lays out $40 billion worth of stockholder equity and cash for that, and basically all their cash for the last quarter. So I think there is the concern about when you have these big players doing big moves like that, there are going to be ways of things to make it uncomfortable if you're not prepared and you don't have an alternate backup plan. So I think you're going to see more of that. I don't think you're going to see a wholesale exodus from ARM because in the near-term future, these companies really don't have any choice. But I guarantee you that the ones that are thinking ahead are figuring out, where can we use this? How can we minimize it? What would we have to do to, if nothing else, if you've watched anything in the telecom world, one company who used an upstart as a big ugly stick to beat down the other one in price. So if nothing else, it at least becomes a play if you make a credible threat with it as a defensive move. And then there are also lots of positives you can do with it because it is a very straightforward architecture, and that translates into speed, power, and low power, and all those sorts of things.
Right, but I think the key point here, though, is RISC-V doesn't have the quote unquote ecosystem and the mind share, the market share that ARM has. It's still really early days for the technology.
Well, that's true. And it's like us trying to move into any place that's dominated by a large competitor. And those dynamics are going to change. And they're going to do nothing but grow and improve. It fits in with Clayton Christensen's disruptive technology approach. Maybe right now they're a little bit under the wire because they're not what the most aggressive and most demanding users would require. Give them time and watch as they move up until suddenly they cross the threshold where it's suitable for mass market technologies. We'll see if NVIDIA and ARM are aware of their trajectories and make sure that they don't abandon the low end as they go forward.
It seems, though, that there's a lot of talk within the RISC-V community of going upstream, right? Getting to that server, which I think is the holy grail. And I think the thinking, or at least some early prognostications, are that they might have a RISC-V server maybe in 5 years. I think is the CEO of Sci-Fi that actually is aspiring to realize something like that, probably in the next few years.
Well, look at what the hyperscalers are already doing right now.
Yeah.
Microsoft started jamming FPGAs into their boards. Google has got their own Tensor processor. I don't know what they're doing on processor. Facebook's doing their own. Amazon's doing their own. And so if you look what the hyperscalers are wanting to do is it's almost like, let's throw some money to these guys and see what they can do with RISC-V. And because the big guys who are buying all the server stuff, they've got the expertise and the money to actually go and do this if they want to. And that's much to another semiconductor's detriment. But when you need to hyperscale, you need to optimize for your domain-specific architecture. Maybe you don't care about the other 75% of the complex instruction set that you're really not ever going to use if you design your servers and your artificial intelligence machines properly and you're taking advantage of your TPUs in those situations. I think it's an opportunity with the big boys.
To wrap up, what are your thoughts on neutrality? We hear ARM needs to maintain neutrality as it is absorbed into NVIDIA's portfolio.
Yeah, that gets to the situation it faces anybody if you're buying your core technology from somebody who happens to turn out to be your competitor. Today, what's happening, take for example, in the graphics card business. NVIDIA, as far as I know, doesn't really make graphic cards to sell, but the whole entire infrastructure is built on their chips of technology with 1,001 card vendors that make these things in the Far East. And so from that situation, they're not really competing that. Look at years ago when Qualcomm was still ramping up their chip business. They actually sold and made CDMA phones. I had a Qualcomm phone, one of my first ones. Sort of embarrassing, the place I worked with, because it was an alternate cell phone company. But that's the same thing. Until they did that, you would never find all the cell phone companies picking up and running with Qualcomm chips, as Qualcomm was going to be making phones. So that didn't happen. The other thing you can see, I think, will be part of their business model is actually doing like a Qualcomm of basically, here are reference designs, here are things you can do with our ARM, with our NVIDIA core processor, which may be even skinny down for different applications and industries. And those start to become seeded as reference designs, which whatever it's targeted for, there's 1,001 companies that will suddenly be OEM manufacturers in Shenzhen making these things. So that is a good opportunity for them. I think we're going to find the neutrality part is trust but verify. The fact that there is so much laid out into it, it doesn't seem feasible that all that NVIDIA has in mind is that we're going to make our money back by choke holding the market. No, I think they're going to grow the market, or as somebody once said, they're going to grow the pie, make it bigger for everyone, and including the smaller startup companies who will have capabilities that aren't really anticipated by the stock markets today and the analysts.
My feeling is NVIDIA has been trying to make platforms going beyond the GPU because, they don't have the whole equation, right? They pretty much only have GPU. So they're looking at building reference platforms for various applications, whether it's in the telco realm, whether it's in the embedded realm for IoT, whether it's for server or the data center, what have you. So RISC-V, as it matures, it'll probably become a nice counterpoint and option for chip designers and chip manufacturers going forward. Most of the RISC-V chips are manufactured using older process nodes, right? 28 nanometer plus probably. But I'm sure that they'll start to advance as the applications become more premium. And maybe eventually if they get into the smartphone level, then, they'll be there at 3 nanometer.
Well, they're
along with everyone else.
or two. Has anybody announced 2 nanometers yet? I'm not surprised, but I'll wait and see.
Is that even possible? Oh, geez. Incredible. Right.
But I think it's an incredible opportunity. I don't think they're going to go away. I think, if nothing else, that NVIDIA ARM will respond to competition rather. Maybe even a little bit of co-opetition as industry grows. And I think you're going to have more and more designers and companies are looking at these as alternatives, but initially maybe as a defensive measure, but as they get more expertise with actually optimizing their architectures for their applications, why stop at 2 cores or 4 or 6 or 8, and why make something that looks like a PC? Particularly, they've got low power processing elements and more complex things that you're doing as well. And take, for example, they're supporting or going to support vector arithmetic, which is going to be very important as they move more into the machine learning space.
Right.
So I think you're going to see chip vendors doing these sorts of things. And one of the first things I expect you're going to see with these is, they know how to put the cores and DSPs together. It won't be too long. You'll be seeing them marrying them with neural network accelerators, which will allow the low power and the tiny ML cases to scale up to that next level of complexity without blowing the power out of the water. So wait and see.
Well, they're already doing it with FPGA, so we'll see what's next. Definitely an area to keep an eye out on, and something that we at neXt Curve are looking at. I'm sure you guys are you're going to continue to look at least, I know, right? And I'm sure it's going to be very relevant for the work that you are doing at SAR Insights and Consulting. So, hey, Joe, thanks once again for joining me on another very interesting discussion. And, take a moment to plug yourself before we sign off here.
I just wrapped up a research report we put on headphone system of chip solutions. One of the key things there is the movement of machine learning applications into the tiny ML world and need for low-powered applications. We see the domain-specific architectures coming into play with Apple and the AirPod Pro, so how they can do what they are doing now. And I think this is we'll see more and more of RISC-V showing up in specialized low power artificial intelligence and machine learning based chips. So.
Okay, and so to our listeners and viewers, thanks for joining us. Please subscribe to our YouTube and Apple Podcast channels and visit us at www.next-curve.com. And until next time, be safe and healthy. Joe, once again, thank you so much.
Sure enough. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Visit us at www.next-curve.com.